So I feel like this thing lately is kind of taking a little bit of a turn that I didn't quite expect, but then on another level intuitively already understood. And so I wanted to, I guess, just share experience of that and yeah, just what's happening exactly. There's energetically, so I'll start by speaking energetically. Energetically, for a while now, there's been a ping-ponging between energy kind of being focused in this general area, in the mind space and the head space, and a ping-ponging between that and settling down into the body. And there's this it's very visceral. So the mind has seen that it doesn't know who I am. It's very, very clearly. The mind has, I don't want to say for certain, but it really feels like it's kind of given up on trying to figure out who I am. And it doesn't know. And what it has come up with is emptiness. And all of the thoughts and constructions and stories and labels and ways that I identified as a good person, as a kind person, as a helpful person, as a spiritual person, as an intelligent person, all the ways have really collapsed. Just various coping mechanisms really just collapsed. And kind of what's been happening recently is there's this energetic shift. And it's, when I say energetic, I think I used to, the mind used to think it would have understood this. If I had, heard somebody say something like this, the mind would have been like, oh yeah, I understand that. But I didn't really, because this is much more of it's a sensation. It's like a visceral feeling that exists in reality. And what I've realized is that the mind mimics things. So the mind mimics sensation. So for instance, because of the way that the mind is set up, there will be interpretations. So say I stub my toe. The mind has, a recollection of that happening. So it will take a sensation and it will mimic pain. It will mimic sensation that may or may not actually be happening, because that is what it has come to expect through patterns and through habituation and through conditioning. And it will also resist what's happening. And I might have just forgotten. I might have just lost track of where exactly that was going. Give me a moment. So the mind mimics, but it doesn't actually know direct experience. Only from here down can have a sense of direct experience, because direct experience may include emotional energies that are arising, sensations that are arising, and then the mind mimics those things. It mimics emotion, it mimics sensation, and heightens those things, or tells a story about them, or creates some identification around them. But here what's been happening is, and this is what I imagine people talk about when they talk about, different, I've heard like Adyashanti, for instance, talks about different levels of awakening, like awakening in the mind, awakening of the heart, awakening of the gut. And what feels like is happening right now is there's a dropping into this space. And it's not a conceptual thing. It's a very visceral, like the attention is dropping and being pulled and beginning to rest here. And so anytime there's like a drawing up into the head, and really what that feels like when I actually sit and sense it you know, the mind being kind of the primary place of attention, is there's almost like this contraction behind the eyes, in the head behind the eyes. And, you know, I had no idea. I would have heard that a while, you know, like a year or even probably 6 months ago, and had no idea what that meant, because I wasn't attuned to really the sensations in the body on that level. And so recently there's been like, it's starting to drop. So this space is starting to relax. And I remember saying in one of my previous videos that there was still tension here, and I just felt tension kind of in the head space, and I didn't fully understand that. And but there's this energetic dropping that's happening and coming to rest more here. And this sensing into it, the heart, what one might call the heart space, is the place of intimacy. That is where intimacy with the 10,000 things occurs, from the 10,000 things being everything, and intimacy being unity or oneness. And the mind tries to mimic that. So throughout my own life, the mind tried to mimic intimacy by creating fantasies and stories and thought patterns around like idyllic love or external ways that intimacy, that yearning for intimacy would be met. But the mind can never understand that. The mind will never understand, you can call it intimacy, unity, oneness. The mind cannot comprehend that. And it's afraid to let go, because letting go into true intimacy means the death of who we believe ourselves to be, who the mind believes that it is, any way that there is identification happening. And so intimacy with the 10,000 things, with everything, happens, it feels to me, happens when that attention settles into the heart space. And so what's happening here recently is that what is starting to lead is here. Where attention is beginning to rest is here, is in the heart space. And as that dropping started happening, I didn't really realize what was happening, but there was deep shadow work that came up. So all the like fundamental ways that I would try to escape or avoid real intimacy because it was scary, because intimacy lies beyond identification and beyond ego, completely beyond ego. And so the mind is terrified of that because it can't know that. It can only try to mimic it, but it can never have direct experience of it. It can simulate it. The mind is a simulation machine, but it can't know it. And so it's terrifying to let that go, but all of these really deep shadows and conditioning and habits, ways that the mind would try to mimic the intimacy that it can't know as a way to avoid letting go. And here, that a big part of that was what a term that I've come across recently called limerence, which is where there's usually a person is kind of gloved onto as an object, and there's an image created of a person, and then there's like a fantasy created in the mind, and in that fantasy, the object, the limerent object, the person, the image, is fulfilling the desire for intimacy, and all of that's happening in the mind. So the mind is afraid to let go into what real intimacy is, which is beyond anything that it can comprehend, and so it creates false intimacy, mechanical intimacy, what it tries to mimic intimacy, which it can't actually do. And there's all these ways that we do that. So sex is another big one, and I've done that in the past. So any way that validation is chased, validation is a substitute for intimacy. So social media, me wanting validation through YouTube, subtly wanting validation through putting out YouTube videos. There's all these ways that the mind is trying to mimic validation, and it gets a high from that. To mimic intimacy, not validation. It tries to mimic intimacy by creating validation, but that's only temporary. And so we chase people, we chase sex, we chase romantic love, we chase certain states. So, like psychedelic states, which often come along with unity experiences or experience of like real intimacy, but those are all just experiences. And then as we come out of those states, or as we sober up from those states, the awareness gets pulled back into the mind, and then it mimics using mechanical shortcuts like sex, like social media, like fantasy, like psychedelics, like food, like drugs. And that's like, that stuff isn't bad. That's the thing. It's not bad. It's natural. It's like a natural way that, because we're conditioned, the mind is so strong, the pull of the mind is so strong that it doesn't know any better. It's like a protective mechanism. It's a way to try to get a need met in the absence of being able to drop into true intimacy, which is beyond ego, beyond the self, beyond who we think we are. And that's terrifying. It literally feels like death. Feels like death. And so of course that's going to be terrifying. And there's like I've heard like in spiritual circles people talking about like the path of the heart, and I think there's different ways, and I've seen like even all these different avenues have their own like really big traps. So even like non-duality and more radical spiritual messages, they all have their traps, because an ego can take any of those things. So a path of non-duality, where you can say there is no doer, which essentially is negating this, negating intimacy, negating negating the fact that there are emotions arising. And emotions are simply just sensations in the body. They're energies, but the mind warps stories into it and categorizes them as good and bad, but it's just something that's arising. So if we err on the side of like more avoidant, there's like a kind of a negating of this piece, a negating of the intimacy of having to dive into the ways that we're avoiding. I mean, really all it is, either way, you can negate the intimacy, or you can negate, so like if you talk about a path of the heart, you can negate the having to look into the mind and see that you're nothing. So focusing on love and light and creating an identity around that. Yo, quit. This dog is wide open right now. So negating having to, or what's being asked for, which is to look into the mind and to see that what you are doesn't exist, and to deconstruct that or there can be an attachment to an idea that there is no doer, that there's nobody to do anything, therefore, you know, there's nothing to do, nowhere to go, no need to feel anything, in a way that the mind then attaches to, well, that emotion's not true, and negates all those things. But just all of it is, both of those things are ways to avoid. They're just different mechanisms, different ways that the mind avoids what actually is, the reality of what is. And so it seems that in this process there's just a natural, I guess maybe it's like a maturing, but a dropping of awareness, and to not only be like, to include the emptiness, but include everything that's arising, whether it's sadness or grief or anger, or the stories of trauma that we've been avoiding and resisting, the stories of pain, the ways that we avoid true intimacy by escaping into the mind and trying to find unity and oneness in the mind. But it's so sneaky. And so it's like, it's very interesting to come to look at, you know, these different, I guess you would maybe call them like schools of spiritual thought, and realize that, you know, the masses in each one, like the majority of people in each one are, maybe it's just a matter of being hooked up or conditioned in a certain way, but they are avoiding the other school of thought. Like, there's a truth in both. You know, both are true. They're like each like one aspect of something, but we avoid whatever we're kind of hooked up to avoid. Hopefully that makes sense. I don't know if any of that actually makes sense. It makes, like, all of a sudden, it's, you know, there's something deepening here, and it's very, I don't know, it was a little surprising, actually, you know. But there was always this intuition that it wasn't just the emptiness, but the emptiness was very alluring, but there was some knowing here that there was something beyond the emptiness, and something to the kind of the schools of thought that are more heart-centered. But that's not it. That's like half the picture. Like, the extreme heart-centeredness, the extreme love and light is just half of the picture, and then the extreme, you know, non-duality is half the picture, because both of those get turned by the, you know, the mind takes those and turns them into like a devotion, like something to worship, something new to believe in, something new to identify with. And it's so sneaky, so sneaky. But it's like one doesn't negate the other. It's all of it. It's all of it. And so I came across this, it was Susanna Marie. She's lovely. And I came across this meditation practice that she suggested, and I don't remember where she said she got it from, but it's been really interesting to play with. And it's a practice where you close the eyes and you bring the attention to what would be the heart space, or just the sensation. And then you breathe in and out, almost imagining you're breathing like you have, what she says is, imagine that you have a nose in the center of your chest and you're breathing in and out through that space. But it's really just sensing into that space and encouraging the attention to rest there, is what it feels like. I'm just doing that maybe for like 5 minutes a day, a few times a day. And at least what's happened here is that that just kind of came along the right time, as you know, other things were opening. And it just like kind of fit into this puzzle that I didn't really even know was being put together. Little did I know. And then here's this meditation practice that comes along that just like, oh, this piece fits here. Here's a key. Here's another key. So it's been an interesting practice actually to, because there's been an extreme awareness of when attention gets drawn up into the mind or into fantasy or into seeking validation or wanting connectedness or seeking anything really. So like social media, finding myself in a fantasy of like some future time when I will be better, my life will be better, or some story, any story. And noticing that trigger, like those triggers, those moments have become very obvious, and I'm starting to like notice them in a moment, like, oh, there's this thing happening, and redirecting. So redirecting from intimacy, the false intimacy that the mind is trying to create, to sensation in the body, intimacy with self, intimacy with reality. So it's redirecting from false intimacy to true intimacy and kind of rewiring, which has been interesting. So we'll see how that goes. Just a little update, I guess. Something that has been opening and unfolding and deepening. So I wanted to share. And sharing it also helps solidify, not solidify, but just soften things. And yeah, I don't know, does something, feels necessary somehow. I don't know. I don't know anything, but yeah, so heart-centeredness, path of the heart, love and light, that's not it. But also, there is no doer, there is nothing to do, there is no one, nothing is true, emotions are not true, that's not true, that's not true. That is true, and also that's not it. Each is true, and also they're not it. It's like two sides of a coin. You can't ignore the other side, because it's the same thing. It's all the same thing. And you have to come to see both, to know both, to know unity, because unity is the whole coin, not just focusing on half the coin. So